If you want to know when an oil crisis becomes truly dangerous, do not start at the gas station. By the time the price on the sign changes enough for everyone to start arguing about it, the real damage has already moved through the system. That is how these things always work. The public waits for pain to become visible. Serious investors watch for the point where the visible story and the physical story stop matching. That is where I believe we are now. We are being told the situation is manageable. The strait is open, then it is closed, then it is open again, then it is restricted, then the markets are reassured, then the futures price falls, and then the stock market behaves as if a dangerous problem has somehow become a small inconvenience. That is the official mood. I do not trust it. I trust the physical world more than I trust the paper world. I trust ships more than speeches. I trust shortages more than slogans. I trust what a refinery has to pay for a real barrel more than what a futures screen says when somebody is trying to calm the public. That is the line I want you to hold in your mind from beginning to end. The danger here is not just that oil is expensive. The danger is that the paper price is still telling a story of control while the physical market is already behaving like something is badly wrong. And when those two worlds separate too far, the paper world eventually gives up and chases reality. That is when the real pain begins. I have seen enough cycles to know that markets can lie very politely for a while. They can smile while the plumbing underneath is already straining. They can celebrate one headline, one announcement, one diplomatic performance, one relief rumor, and pretend the structure has been repaired when all that actually happened was that fear was delayed. Delay is not repair. That distinction matters enormously right now. If I had to explain this whole setup with one image, I would say the world is standing behind a paper dam. On the front side of the dam, everything still looks organized. Oil futures are high, yes, but not yet apocalyptic. Stocks are still near the upper end of their range. The official message says things are difficult but under control. The White House wants credit. Wall Street wants calm. Commentators want a story that does not force them to admit that something larger may already be moving toward us. Behind the dam, physical reality is piling up. And physical reality always wins. That is the first principle. You can manage narrative. You can manage price expectations. You can push paper. You can talk about supply routes, contingency plans, strategic reserves, ceasefires, negotiations, and temporary disruptions. But you cannot print physical barrels. You cannot tweet natural gas into a fertilizer plant. You cannot declare a tanker route safe if the physical system no longer behaves as if it is safe. That is why I care so much about the gap between paper oil and physical oil. If you ask a casual observer what oil costs, he will probably quote the number on the screen. That number matters for financial markets. But it is not the full truth. The real truth is what someone has to pay if they need actual delivery. Not a contract, not a chart, not a financial placeholder. A real barrel moved through the real world to a real destination on a real timeline. When that physical price runs far above the paper price, something important is happening. The market is confessing in two languages. One language says everything is still being managed. The other says people who need real oil are paying whatever they must because the system is much tighter than the public has been told. That is not a normal spread. That is a warning. The reason I take it seriously is simple. For years, paper oil and physical oil generally moved close together. They could separate a little under stress, $1, $2, a few dollars in a real scare. But when the gap blows out far beyond the ordinary range, I stop thinking of it as a technical curiosity and start treating it as a structural signal. Because the paper market can calm psychology for a while, it cannot create supply. That is the entire problem. Now let us step back and ask the adult question, how much oil is actually missing? This is where people get fooled by percentages. They hear a number and think it sounds manageable because it does not yet feel catastrophic inside a spreadsheet. But oil is not a spreadsheet input. Oil is the transport system of modern civilization. It is freight, it is aviation, it is shipping, it is industrial feedstock, it is plastics, it is heating, it is fertilizer, it is how food moves, it is how supply chains stay alive, it is the plumbing underneath ordinary life. The world uses about 100 million barrels a day. If somewhere between 8 and 13 million barrels a day is effectively missing or blocked, that is not a detail. That is a large wound in the global energy system. It is the equivalent of losing half of America's daily oil usage over and over again every day while pretending the world can rearrange itself quickly and painlessly. It cannot. Reserves help for a while. Diversion helps for a while. Emergency measures help for a while. But a buffer is not the same thing as restored flow. That is one of the oldest mistakes in commodity markets. People confuse the existence of inventory with the existence of supply. Inventory is only time. It buys breathing room. It does not solve the shortage. And once the buffers are burned through, the market must stop pretending. That is what I believe is approaching. The world can live off the final pre-disruption barrels for a while. Ships already in motion arrive, contracts already moving through the system still clear. Existing reserves get released. Substitutions get attempted. Demand reduction begins in scattered ways. That is how the first stage looks. It creates the illusion that maybe the warnings were exaggerated, but buffer is not supply. The moment the last clean layer of old flow disappears, competition for the next barrel changes character. That is when physical buyers start paying up much harder. That is when the paper price loses room to hide. That is when gasoline, transport, food, and bond markets begin to feel what the futures screen was trying not to say. That is why I care about timing, not precise day-by-day prophecy. I have no interest in pretending I know the exact hour a market will surrender to reality. But sequence matters. First the disruption, then the buffer burn, then the physical premium, then the paper catch-up, then the economic pain becomes democratic. That is the sequence I am watching. Now, let me name the 5 mechanisms inside this shock, because once you name the mechanisms, the story stops sounding like chaos and starts sounding like structure. The first mechanism is the paper dam. This is the visible futures market trying to reassure the world that the shortage is still manageable. It is the screen price staying lower than physical urgency would suggest. It is narrative buying time. It is the confidence game saying one more week, one more rumor, one more policy move, one more announcement, one more excuse. For years, paper claims made this market feel deeper than it really was. That works until enough physical buyers need actual barrels instead of financial comfort. Once that point arrives, the dam is under pressure. The second mechanism is the buffer burn. This is what happens when people say, if the shortage is so bad, why do shelves still look full? Why are stations still open? Why is the economy not already screaming? The answer is because the world is still consuming what was already moving through the system before the disruption fully hit. It is living off stored time. But stored time runs out. That is the cruel part. The public tends to feel safe during the most deceptive stage, the stage where yesterday's flow is still masking today's damage. The third mechanism is the import illusion. Americans keep hearing that we are the world's gas station now, that we are somehow protected by our own energy power. I do not like slogans where arithmetic is required. If the country imports more crude than it exports, then it is still exposed. You do not become immune to a global oil shock because your political class found a patriotic way to describe your energy map. The United States still depends on incoming crude. It still lives inside a world market. Refineries need the right feedstocks. Transport routes matter. Replacement barrels matter. If the globe is paying a higher real price, the United States does not get to live in a separate moral universe where it somehow keeps enjoying yesterday. Cost structure. A stress system does not respect national marketing. The fourth mechanism is the fertilizer echo. This part matters because the public always treats food inflation as though it appeared mysteriously. It usually did not. It was seeded earlier in the energy chain. Natural gas and energy feed into fertilizer. Fertilizer feeds into food production. Food costs show up later. That lag is politically convenient because it lets officials deny the connection. But the connection is real. Energy shock first, agriculture input stress next, food pain later. That is why I pay attention to fertilizer markets in an oil crisis. They are not a side issue. They are the echo that tells you the shock has left the fuel system and entered the food system. The fifth mechanism is the bond fuse. This is where the whole thing stops being a consumer story and becomes a state capacity story in a country carrying almost $40 trillion of debt. Higher inflation is not merely annoying, it makes it harder for the Federal Reserve to cut rates. If rates stay elevated while bond yields keep pushing higher, debt service rises. If debt service rises, deficits worsen. If deficits worsen, the Treasury must issue more debt into a less forgiving market. Then the whole machine begins leaning harder on confidence. That is the fuse. A country can survive an oil shock more easily than it can survive an oil shock that feeds inflation, keeps rates elevated, and pushes the debt machine closer to a point where financing itself becomes a larger story than growth. That is why I keep watching the 10-year yield. People say oil shocks are about recession. Sometimes they are. Today they are also about debt geometry, and debt geometry is much less forgiving when the base is already unstable. Now let us go one layer wider, because the bond market is telling a story that deserves much more attention than it is getting. When major sovereign yields rise across the United States, the UK, Europe, and Japan, while another major power sees its long yields fall, the message is not subtle. Capital is deciding which systems look more stable under stress. The United States used to benefit almost automatically from that kind of fear. Fear flowed into dollars and treasuries. That was the old script. But if the cost of funding the American state rises while the rest of the world is supposed to believe America has controlled the situation, then something deeper is happening. The safe haven story is no longer as clean as it used to be. That matters because the U.S. 10-year yield is not some decorative number for economists. Mortgage rates care about it, corporate borrowing costs care about it, car loans care about it, the government, S-owned debt service cares about it. When that yield climbs toward the zone where the debt burden starts feeding on itself, the issue is no longer theoretical, it becomes mechanical. Oil up, inflation pressure up, Fed flexibility down, yields higher. Debt service worse, deficits wider, confidence more important. That is the spiral. And if you want to understand why I treat this moment seriously, that is the sentence to study. Now I want to talk about markets because this is where the public gets seduced most easily. The stock market is acting as if everything can still go right. That is the part I distrust most. Markets are capable of pricing risk beautifully in some periods and denying obvious structure in others. In 1973, the market did not immediately behave as if a historic oil shock had redefined the landscape. It took time. The first reaction was not full recognition. The pain came later. In 1990, the Gulf shock was real but shorter, and the recovery came faster. Today, people keep trying to borrow those memories selectively as if they can choose the comforting historical analogy and ignore the uncomfortable one. That is not analysis. That is emotional curation. If the supply hit is much larger, the debt burden much heavier, the inflation backdrop stickier, and the paper versus physical split much wider, then the market does not get to use the same old assumptions for free. It will have to earn them. That is what I do not think it has done yet. The SP near highs while consumer sentiment is deeply depressed should bother you. Historically, the ordinary family buying gas and groceries has not been the foolish side of that divergence. The market can pretend longer than a household can, but eventually one of them must yield. I would not bet against the household. Sense of strain. That is another reason I think the current calm is deceptive. The person filling up the tank and buying groceries is often reading the real economy more honestly than the futures market is. Now, let me say the hardest thing simply. You cannot print atoms, you can print money, you can print narratives, you can print confidence, you can print promises, you cannot print physical oil, you cannot print unrestricted shipping flow, you cannot print repaired infrastructure. And once the physical world gets too misaligned with the paper story breaks. That is what I think is coming. Not because I enjoy drama, because the structure points there. Now, what would I actually do with that conclusion? First, I would stop treating this as a short headline cycle. This is not about one tweet, one rumor, one ceasefire headline, one presidential victory lap. It is about the underlying supply geometry. Second, I would think in second-order effects, not only first-order ones. Gasoline matters, yes, but fertilizer matters, food matters, bond yields matter, consumer strain matters, corporate margins matter, deficits matter. That is how real shocks move. Through layers, third, I would become much more suspicious of paper comfort. When physical and paper prices separate unusually far, I do not treat the lower paper number as the truth. I treat it as the temporary political number. Fourth, I would think carefully about how much of my life depends on low inflation and easy rates remaining intact, because if that assumption breaks, a lot of portfolios that looked elegant in calmer times start showing their weakness all at once. Fifth, I would remember that serious markets do not give you a trumpet before they move. They give you plumbing signs. Physical premiums, inventory strain, transport rerouting, fertilizer spikes, yield stress. The public waits for the trumpet. The investor who cares about survival learns to read the plumbing. That is the advantage. Now let me close with the question I think matters most. What if the market is not pricing an oil shock at all? What if it is pricing a story told by paper while the real economy is already being repriced by physical scarcity? Because if that is what is happening, then the next move is not just higher gasoline. It is broader inflation, higher food costs later, more pressure on bond yields, more pressure on valuation, more pressure on the debt machine. And then, only then, the stock market begins admitting what the physical world knew much earlier. That is why I care less about today as paper quote, and more about the system underneath it. Physical reality always wins. Not immediately, but inevitably, and in every serious supply crisis I have ever studied, the people who trusted the physical world before the paper story broke had a far better experience than the people who waited for the headline version of reality to arrive. That is what I believe this moment is asking from us. Now, not panic, not prophecy. Just the discipline to stop mistaking a paper price for a solved problem. Because once the physical world becomes too big to hide, the bill arrives very fast. And the market does not usually send that bill to the people who prepared early. It sends it to the people who kept believing the screen.